Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. Um, if you didn't hear me earlier, we've got the Beyond the Classroom credit posted all over the place, so make sure you get your credit. Um, I'm excited for at least three reasons. One, this is the second of our Center for the Stories speaker series. So you guys are here for history in the making, and I'm delighted to see some folks in the crowd. Um, I'm thrilled to talk about the Center for Story. I'll just briefly say I'm Sean Murphy. I teach here, and I was brought in to direct the Center for Story. And what that is, it's an initiative that we started. We're trying to create a master's in storytelling. And as part of that, to raise awareness and just talk about story, which is part of what we're doing today, we're having a bunch of free public events. The speaker series is part of it. We're going to have a podcast. We're going to have a blog. In the fall, we're going to have a story festival. So stay tuned for more information. But mostly, I'm excited today to be joined by Steve Herman, who I'll introduce in a second. He's been gracious enough to come chat about story. And in particular, we want to focus on how story and narrative impacts our media, what's going on in media today, what's coming down the pike, and why this is especially important during an election year. And hopefully we'll get into some of all those implications. So let me introduce my special guest. Stephen L. Herman is the chief national correspondent for the Voice of America. From 2017 to 2021, he was the senior White House correspondent and subsequently VOA's White House bureau chief. His latest book, Behind the White House Curtain, a senior journalist's story of covering the president and why it matters, is going to be published in June of this year by Kent State University Press. He's currently a professor here at Shenandoah and has served as an adjunct lecturer in the journalism department at the University of Richmond. He's also been the jurist journalist in residence at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and a Kiplinger Fellow at Ohio University. So we are joined by someone with considerable experience. I couldn't think of a better person to join this series. Please join me in welcoming Steve Herman. All right, Steve, I've been looking forward to this for a while since we first connected and talked. I know that you and I could speak unprompted for hours about this topic because we both care about it. Hopefully, what you come away with today, among other nuggets of information, is why you should care about narrative and media during an election year and in general. And just like last time, if anyone was here, just curious, was anyone at the first speaker series? We got all okay. We want this to be super informal. So questions throughout. If anything occurs to you, you got a question or a comment, we're touching on something you want to hear more about, just let me know and I'll call on you.
Just don't throw anything at us.
If you throw something, make sure it hits the front of the stage, but not the speakers, because we're old and can't roll with the punches like we used to. So, I mean, how to begin? I think my opening salvo, Steve, would be, to set the tone. I think it's fair to say that we're in a moment right now where if you're following the media at all, one of the things we hear a lot about is trust in the media is at an all-time low. No one trusts media. Things like fake media are a running kind of commentary. How do we address that? And from your historical perspective, like, is some of that overblown? Why do people feel that way? What can we do about it? We could probably spend the whole hour just on that question, but thinking about the state of the media, what's your perspective from someone that's on the inside?
Thanks, Sean. And no, I don't think it's overblown because, look, I do this for a living, right? And I think I have a pretty good idea of the media landscape. And it's, even for somebody like me, it can get really, really difficult to process all the information that's coming at you from various angles. And if you're a more casual consumer of content, as it's called now, I kind of hate that word, it's overwhelming because, let's face it, there was an era not so long ago where there were these major filters of the information that we got. We had one time just 3 network newscasts, and maybe the PBS McNeil-Lair hour got 1% ratings. You could, turn on your radio and there was an hourly newscast that was by one of these big networks. And you had a newspaper or 2, if you were lucky, in whatever town you were living in, that came either in the morning or the evening. And the information from the national arena and overseas was filtered through one of, back then, 2 wire services, Associated Press or United Press International. And so people kind of knew the sources of the information. It was very much a middle of the road approach, although newspapers in towns would have an editorial page, and a newspaper was usually deemed Republican or Democrat. And so there were editorials in there, but the content of the news wasn't really that much different. Nowadays, people in general don't read a newspaper. They don't watch the network newscasts. And I would say if the majority of the audience in here turned on an evening newscast from CBS or ABC or NBC, they probably wouldn't watch it for very long, because of the commercials that are on there are for, pharmaceutical drugs for, people with arthritis or, incontinence diapers or things like that. And it's obvious that the majority of the people watching were the people that were watching 50 years ago. Okay. They've lost the younger audience, and they know that they've lost it and aren't even really trying anymore. There are some exceptions. So most people, and I imagine if we have a show of hands here, how many people get their news primarily from Facebook? TikTok. Okay. What else is there? Twitter's kind of dying, right? Twitter. Okay. So it's social media. The problem is that I enjoyed all these platforms when they started out, and I was once very, very active and very prominent on Twitter. And what I loved about these platforms, especially Twitter, it was like a wire service in a sense. Okay, you got a little snippet of breaking news as it's happening, and the feed by default. Does everybody know what reverse chronological order means? Do we need to explain that? I'm just asking. Does anybody not know what it means? Okay. Now what's happened is by default, you get on your page on Facebook or the videos on TikTok or on Twitter, the alternatives, what that service has decided that it wants to serve up to you based on an algorithm. Okay. And so the one I use the most often now is called Threads, which is part of the Microsoft Meta universe. But by default, every time I keep forgetting, I've got to go click on a certain spot and change it over to reverse chronological or my followers instead of the for you. It's like I can't decide what I want to see. So if you're, you go down certain rabbit holes, and YouTube's the same way, right? You're just going to see more and more and more of the same content. So it's great, if you're into puppies and photos of cats or, singing animals or whatever, then you're going to see a lot of that. But the problem is if you're sort of, taking a look at something that would have been considered fringe content at one time, you're just going to see more and more and more of that, and people go down the rabbit holes, and that's how we get QAnon. Okay. And that can be very dangerous to the society.
Yeah. So, one of part of what Steve's getting at is from our generation, he's explaining how when we came up, there were just less sources of news, but also the news was a noun that meant, and even back then, we didn't do this back then, but it was objective in the sense that this was an attempt to depict what was happening in real life. And basically, we're reporting, there's no agenda. So what's been complicated is that there are multiple sources now with very obvious agendas. But I think what Steve just touched on, which is important, especially for younger generations, is this notion of curated content and how, depending on what your online habits are, what you see about the world and what we used to call, say, an objective assessment of what happened that day is filtered through what you're interested in. So even if you really are trying to get and we have to use, unfortunately, I think we have to say objective, but just for the purposes of this discussion, objective, you might not be getting an unfiltered view just based on your search habits. So even to absorb the news now requires some effort on the consumer's behalf. And I think that's a significant shift, right?
Yeah, but I think we should also mention that, say, if, I'm going back to the 1960s, for example, and you had what arguably was very standardized, bland, fairly non-controversial content. And if you wanted to break out of that bubble, it was very difficult to find alternative sources of information. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the internet. You could go, maybe your library might have some, interesting alternative magazines, both for people that were very liberal and very conservative. But mostly it was, kind of word of mouth. Or, you could figure out, oh, there's this magazine out there, maybe on, very left of center Commentary Magazine or the John Birch Society on the far right. But these things weren't easy to find. And you really had to be very committed by going to your library or going to, they used to sell magazines at the, what was it called? The Five and Dime store, the pharmacy, whatever. But even there, these magazines were mostly controlled by, corporations that were entertainment minded or whatever. But once in a while you could find, especially if you were in a bigger city, you could get access to this content. But if you were in, Keokuk, Iowa, you probably weren't going to get access to anything outside of this mainstream. So, we can say there is a positive that it's much more easy these days to access alternative sources of information. The
Right.
problem is how do you tell what you're reading is factual?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I really wanted to point out today that I think we can have some fun kind of untangling is, at least in the era we're talking about, let's just say pre-21st century. So before the internet in the mid 90s and people really started gravitating toward receiving their content digitally online, the lines were much more stark between what we called news and what we called entertainment. And so I think it's a fascinating kind of evolution or de-evolution of how news is presented, that for a variety of reasons, a lot of them involving money, the lines between entertainment and news have blurred. I would imagine, Steve, you've got some opinions in terms of how that happened, why it happened, and why on balance that's probably not a great thing.
Well, look, it's like any new technology. Splitting the atom led to all kinds of incredible positive scientific innovations, but it also gave us, the hydrogen bomb, and we can blow up the entire world with the technology. And the internet is very similar to that. We can now, and with all this wireless technology, you can communicate with, anybody, anywhere in the world, or a million people at one time. But we now also have infinite sources of information that we can go to. But the problem is, I can remember, first getting on the internet, and I thought it was the most democratic thing that had ever been invented, because anybody could, when the first websites came in, could set up a website, right? And you could do whatever you wanted with the website. If you wanted to devote your website and be the authoritative source about crochet, you could do that. If you wanted to start a news service or focus on the environment or how gardening, whatever, it was an amazing, liberating thing. What happened though is when it started to get tied, you could make money off of this by having ads on your site. Then a lot of people started to come out that were just looking for clicks, right? It wasn't about being accurate or being in depth. It was appealing to our sort of a human tendency, emotional tendencies, passion and outrage and those sort of things. And what happened was that, these sites, remember, Zuckerberg started up, it was the Facebooks. It was meant to be a college student directory. That's all Facebook was meant to be originally. Twitter was started up by a few guys who just thought it was kind of neat to have this sort of messaging service. They had no idea what it was going to be. YouTube started out something completely different. There's a book out, by the way, it's called Extremely Online. If you want to know about the history of all these sites, it's fascinating. But what happened was when they realized, or these things started to become billion-dollar businesses, and you had investors who wanted you to get to the second round, third round of survival and to go public, that was the holy grail, because if you were an investor that put $100,000 into one of these sites, you were going to get maybe $100 million when the company went public. So the emphasis wasn't on quality, it was keeping you hooked to that site for as long as possible. And that's how the algorithms got created. And, there's all this panic and fear about TikTok, right? It's the Chinese, all your information is going back to China or whatever. But much to its credit, TikTok has gotten the algorithm game down to a science better than anybody else out there. And that's why, TikTok is just exploded the way that it is. I don't know whether anybody in this, you saying you get news and information from TikTok. It's like, my question would be, why TikTok and not something else?
Yeah. Well, and that's a good, so I want to get a read of the room. Who here, if you access the news in any way, whatever source you use, just show of hands, who feels that if they want to understand, and I have to do this, truth, but what's going on in the world, who feels confident that they can go to a source and they will get a relatively unbiased account of what's going on? Just show of hands. Okay, show of hands. So those that feel like it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get an objective appraisal. So more people think it's more difficult to get an objective. I think we can try to unpack that a little bit. It's some of it I think stems from this notion of entertainment, infotainment. I was just going to say another show of hands. Who's heard the expression or a variation of the expression? History is written by the victor. Okay, I'd say one thing about that, for better or worse, and there was a lot of both, or a lot of worse actually, but history being written by the victor meant that it had happened. So at least someone was looking at events that had happened. There might have been a spin based on who won the war or who won the election, but there was a sense of we're looking at data and making a judgment. I think what's changed with the ubiquity of social media is history is being written in real time. So we've got these propaganda, we've got these spin masters that are creating news with the notion of winning hearts and minds. And I think that's taken some of the objectivity out. And it's in a way maybe designed to breed some cynicism that everyone's just has an opinion. There's no facts.
Well, there's also, I don't know how many people are familiar with this term, confirmation bias. okay, where people are just looking to have, not to find out objective news and information, but just looking to have their beliefs reinforced or confirmed. And, I think Facebook was, in a negative way, fantastic at doing that. Um, and it's there, and this is being addressed. I think the European Union has been very aggressive in going after these monopolistic practices. If you ever go to a European website, they've got all these things. You've got to consent to getting the cookies on the website. Where in the United States, we've had much more of, what you could argue is a, less socialistic regulatory and more open capitalistic laissez-faire attitude towards all that. Although I think now you have politicians both on the left and the right who are saying this is not a good idea for a variety of reasons that have to do with their own political beliefs that are cracking down on it. But as we've seen through history, there was in the early 20th century, there were, despite much corruption, a cracking down on monopolistic practices. And, we have just a few companies now that are controlling the majority of the interactions on the internet. Although they would be right in saying, we're not forcing you to come to our site. There's a billion websites out there. You can go to any of them. If you're spending all your time on Facebook or YouTube or TikTok, that's your choice. But then we had the issues. There's lawsuits against Instagram because there were young people who were, having very serious body image problems because, they were just being fed these videos of, glamorous, thin young women, or, if you couldn't go out and afford to, spend $1,000 on clothes, every month, there's definitely something wrong with you. So, but, this is always for every generation, where do you draw the line? Right? We don't want the government to be overly controlling what we can view. There's still the Comstock Act, which was originally, anybody ever heard of the Comstock Act? Okay. Which controlled what was going through the mail. Okay. And it was originally they were really trying to crack down on pornography. But now it's being used, I think, to stop, birth control, going through the mail, or, abortion pills or things like that. So is that government overstepping its bounds? So it's difficult for us. And I think the other thing is it's changing so fast, right? I mean, TikTok, if we, how long has TikTok been around in its present form? Less than 10 years, right? There may be a few people who remember AOL, maybe America Online, and so it's like every 5 years, the biggest thing falls off, like Twitter. People are saying Twitter is going to be dead in a couple of years, and they're probably the next big social media platform is something we've not even heard of yet.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you touched on something earlier, Steve, that I think warrants a little more discussion, which is I share, my memory is consistent with yours. When Twitter first arrived, I worked in the tech industry at that time, and there was this tremendous optimism that now, with citizen reporters, especially armed with a cell phone, you could record news as it was happening. There's a hurricane out on the football field. You could record that and say this is happening and share that. It was hard to argue with that. That's real. That's happening. But what I think has happened in the what we, and I won't speak for you, but when I say we, those of us that were really positive about Twitter, and it was harder to censor So whether it was in America or certainly overseas, governments that do actively censor the citizens and the internet, mechanisms like Twitter at least gave the opportunity for people to exchange information globally, and that was awesome. But what I don't think some of us, and I'll put myself, who took properly appreciated was, just like you can share real things undeniably, bad actors have free reign to share literal fake news. We can talk about what fake news means and how that's used as a weapon by politicians, but people that are manipulating events digitally or otherwise to spread misinformation. And it's a lot harder to control that. And that's where we get into this gray area of how much should the government oversee versus freedom. Information wants to be free,
Right.
but there's a responsibility with that. And I think we're still struggling with that.
Well, I'll give you a perfect example of that, Sean. This past weekend, okay, we had an unprecedented attack by Iran on Israel. They flew hundreds of drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles at Israel. And in the past, just a few years ago, pre-Elon Musk, I've had my personal issues with Elon Musk. Look it up on the internet. That would have been the go-to place to find out accurately what was happening in real time. It was a horrible mess because I was on the different social media platforms. I was reporting about what was going on. You had people throwing up information, videos, fake videos that were maybe from, a fire in Texas from 10 years ago. People were copying information from other places, just trying to get clicks. I'm not saying that everybody was malevolent, but they were just, just because now if you on Twitter, you get a lot of people clicking on your stuff, you can make money. Okay. But we know there are deliberate bad actors, as they call them. I hate that term. They're troll farms that are controlled by certain governments in certain countries that are throwing this stuff out there. They're not necessarily trying to convince you of their, if they're Chinese or Russian, that Putin is great or Xi Jinping is a better leader than, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, whatever. They're just trying to sow doubt, to divide our society. It's asymmetrical warfare. They can't invade and take over the United States of America, but they can weaken us by turning ourselves on each other. And it's very effective. The Moscow, for example, was doing this back in the Soviet era, but it's so much more weaponized these days, where it was very clunky and ineffective. Back when there were just like newspapers and the gatekeepers for the big networks, most of the stuff wasn't going to get through. So this is all happening in real time, and so what's happening is exactly what they want to happen. You doubt everything that you're seeing. You can't trust anybody, and they'll put in deliberate information, pretending that they're Antifa or that they're Trump supporters, but it's all fake. And it's very, very dangerous. And so that leads to the question is like, okay, should these platforms be, controlling things better by verifying your ID, whoever has an account on there? But as you said, these platforms are very valuable in repressive countries. You don't want to ask somebody in Burma for their ID and have their real name if they're telling you what the army is doing in massacring civilians. So anonymity does have its place, but anonymity also allows people just to spew out all this fake information. And even if those of us in the media, we all now have fact-checking units trying to sift through all this stuff and put out there. But if it's taking us time to do it with all the sophisticated technology that we have to process this, how is it possible for any individual to do this, or why would they want to do it in real time?
Yeah, I mean, it's now, I think any of us could understandably say, what, it's our job now to have to be basically doubting and verifying what reporters are saying. I just want to add, so Steve talked about how there's very sophisticated attempts from China and Russia in particular to send all this bad information just to confuse things. Even in the States, there's an expression called flood the zone, which a lot of political campaigns, it's so chaos, so that, as Steve already had pointed out, there's just doubt. And I think the goal here isn't to misinform so much as make you feel helpless, because there's so much out there. Then, like I said at the outset, is it your job to figure out what's true and what isn't true? Steve, as a person, with skin in the game and being with your history, what are you and your colleagues, what would you advise younger consumers of news who would understandably look at someone like you or me and say, so what do you expect us to do, or what can we do? What are some strategies?
Well, number one, I think it's very valid to be skeptical. Okay. Don't believe, and I see this even with, people in my own family, people with advanced degrees, oh, I saw something on Facebook today, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, where did the information come from? What is the source of the information? And, they just, it's entertaining, it's exciting, so they want to pass it on. The other problem on the flip side is, depending on one's, and for example, let me just use the New York Times as an example. Okay, the New York Times is probably, in the United States, for a traditional news organization, has the highest level of what I would call quality control. Okay, does that mean they get it right all the time? No. Does that mean they don't have a political bias? No. But if you're going to compare it to like almost everything else out there, it's pretty darn reliable. Yet I see every day on my social media feeds, people both on the left and the right bashing the New York Times because the New York Times story is not conforming to their belief on that particular issue. It's not political. I mean, the transgender issue is huge, and the Israel versus Hamas issue is another one. And if the New York Times is not conforming to whatever their beliefs are, how they believe they know how the New York Times should be reporting the stories. And the New York Times has been having big internal debates about these subjects too. So if this is causing turmoil even inside the New York Times, we have to take a step back and say, okay, the best advice that I can give you is don't get your information from just one source. Okay. Would you only eat McDonald's every single day? I kind of did during high school for a period of years. So, okay. I didn't take my advice back then, but what would happen? I mean, we've seen, there's been documentaries of what happens if you eat chicken McNuggets every day for 30 days, right? It's the same thing. Your news diet has to be, robust. It shouldn't be just desserts or processed foods. But the first thing is we need to step back. It's like I'm teaching a journalism class, but we'll get you in just a second. But what I think is, before we teach journalism classes, we have to teach news literacy. Because what's the point of teaching journalism if even the journalism students can't discern between, what's fake and what's real? I think there's a question there. Yes. I mean, if I want to talk about no bias, almost no bias, then you have to go to the wire services, the Associated Press, Reuters, there's Agence France Presse, Bloomberg, which is financially focused. They're going to be the least biased because they have to serve a wide audience. Their customers are the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fox News. They're going to be as broad as possible. But it's more, meat and potatoes. You know, if we're talking about diet, it's very, here's the facts, ma'am. Um, it's not necessarily the most compelling writing or storytelling as we're talking about. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, for example, those stories that get on the front page usually are great examples of storytelling. Okay, they're compelling reads about whatever the topic is. I can guarantee you those page one stories, even if it's a subject you're not interested in, the writing is really, really good. And it's been through a bunch of editors who've polished it up. Um, does it? It definitely, you know, I think most readers would agree that it has a slightly left of center bias, but there's a lot of people on the left who think the New York Times is, you know, I mean, they're ultra conservative now. It's you know, it's really interesting to see the reaction.
Yeah, and I think if we bring it back a little bit and talk about how do we talk about what does story mean as it relates to media, and how does story mean when it relates to news? And I think that starts to get to our blurred lines of kind of infotainment and this notion of you want people to be interested, you want people to buy or read what you're doing, but you're also trying to tell some truths. Um, I, how do we grapple with, because you just brought up a great point, like, you know, yes, they're well reported, yes, they're well told stories, but then we hear the other side saying, well, the attention spans are not what they used to be. I feel like there's all these competing interests and pressures.
Yeah, well, I think packaging, as we were talking about this in my class today, about I was asking the students if they read this, what is it, Sun E, Shenandoah News every day. And, you know, it's a lot of information in there. It's not very visually appealing. Maybe some of you found out about this through that. That's great if you did. But, you know, the students were confessing that they didn't really read it because it's like too much information and too boring and not packaged well. And people most people don't have the time or the compunction to read an 1,100 word story anymore. And that's why the New York Times, for example, is going much more to multimedia storytelling. I don't know if they've quite gotten the formula. They were trying to do video for a while, and you know, you could tell they really didn't know what they were doing. They weren't a TV network. There was another important point I wanted to make about this. Oh, it's, you know, it's access. You know, the New York Times, if you're going to read more than what, 5 or 10 stories a month, you need a subscription to it. It's not cheap. I mean, maybe they might have a student discount. If you're a student here, you can probably access it, you know, through the library and whatever, but those are a couple of extra hoops to jump through. People just want stuff. And that, again, TikTok is wonderful for this, right? Just sort of pops up. It's visually compelling. It's in a you know, a very short form. I don't know. Does anybody remember Vine videos? Yeah.
I thought I did.
Okay. How long were Vine videos? Originally 6 seconds. Okay. Huge, right? So, you know, if you're expecting somebody to, you know, watch an hour and a half documentary compared to, you know, versus a, you know, TikTok or 6-second videos, it's a challenge. You have to be really, really committed to wanting to access this information. And look, most people, and you know, you can talk about whether this is deliberate as a society or just, you know, where we're at, are, you know, totally tuned out. What are the most popular things that people are watching the longest online or on TV now? Do you have any idea what it is that they're willing to pay the most for? Anybody have a guess? What kind of content? It's not news, I'll tell you that. Sports, right? Yeah, people, you know, I'll pay $100 a month so I can get, you know, ESPN and, you know, the NFL and my college basketball games. But, oh, I don't want to spend $10 a month for a, you know, a news subscription. Oh my God, that's not worth it.
Yeah. So I think I would have been remiss if I didn't at least bring up the M word during this discussion, which is money. And how does money, again, I think for the younger generation, just so you all have a better sense, when there were less sources, newspapers were more read, ironically, in some ways, but advertising was a big way that the newspapers could afford to be in business, pay the reporters, and people had to subscribe to it because there weren't all these other choices. So again, we've got this competing landscape where it's good that there's more free choices, but who's heard the expression, you get what you pay for? If everything's free, there isn't a premium put on accuracy, and perhaps you're not paying the best reporters and writers to do the work. And I think that's another amazing pressure we're feeling in the 21st century, which is, how is it possible? I think if you think about it on a surface level, like, there's more news and there's more content than ever. How are newspapers going out of business? And it's because people don't want to subscribe to them and pay money for it. I certainly don't ask you to tell us how to solve that problem, but would you agree that that's a very bizarre and unavoidable issue?
Yeah, and no one's figured this out. I mean, there's been all sorts of models, remember the advertisements that used to like stream across your feed, and or the pop-ups, I mean, really annoying stuff, and nobody was clicking on them. And so then the advertisers didn't want to pay for that anymore. But I have a question for the audience. Do you know who owns ESPN? Anybody know who owns ESPN? Disney. Who owns ABC News?
Disney.
Disney. Okay. So if you look at, across your news and sport content, again, we're going back to, a few companies owning it. And so what they've tried to do now, there's this desperate race to kind of streaming and bundling, and nobody wants to pay for cable TV anymore. So the remaining people who have cable TV, sort of like the cigarette tax, you're going to pay more and more and more just to get that. And so then now we have the, the cord cutters, and, beyond that, everybody wants to get streaming platform, because why shouldn't you be able to watch the stuff on your phone, right? Why should you have to go home and sit in front of the TV to do it? The problem has always been that the rights issue, again, money. But now things are being licensed for whatever platforms that people are going to. So again, if we're talking about serving the public, the people who can't afford to pay for all this, so there's still, does anybody watch television over the air where they have like an antenna at their house? And anybody at all? Okay. But if you're on a really fixed income, that's going to be probably your only choice. And so you're going to watch, you get Fox and NBC and ABC and CBS and public TV. You're not going to get ESPN. You're not going to get CNN. You're not going to get Fox News. You're not going to get, the movie channels. So, these people at that tier of society are definitely, not going to have access to that variety of information. Even where I live in Stafford County, here in Virginia, and I'm actually on the volunteer on the Stafford County Telecommunications Commission. And I live on a peninsula about 5 miles off of US 1, Route 1. There is a street closer in. It's only about 2 or 3 miles off of Route 1. This is, within 50 miles of our nation's capital. They don't have internet. They don't have cable TV. They don't even have phone service anymore. They pulled out the copper landline, which they had for a few years. They just went off a party line. Okay. Now they can get direct TV. And for internet, they're using a satellite service that's really expensive, and they're trying to homeschool 3 kids. And there's a mom trying to do her job from home. She teleworks, and a dad who works too. Only one of them can get on the internet at any one time. There's no way they're going to be able to do video streaming. The kids can't even do their homework. So from I'm on the county commission, telecommunications commission, it's my top issue right now. So this is in a fairly, it's not, and what they're saying is, this guy was saying, I've got a cousin who lives on, 100 acres in remote Appalachia in West Virginia. He's got broadband and I don't, within tens of miles of Washington, D.C. So there's definitely still a big digital divide in this country too.
And I mean, speaking of story, right? That's a story. What do we make of, what are the priorities and what could be or would be or should be done to kind of address that? Is it a combination of there's not enough people voting to make it worth a politician fighting for? There's not enough money in it, because that is an outrage and it's unbelievable. But I imagine living close to DC and on the coasts, we do overlook what the reality is probably like in most of the what we call flyover states.
The answer is really boring and technical, but I'll say it anyway. On their street, even though I'm more rural, more remote than they are, there's on this street that stretches for a couple of miles, there's only 16 homes. The contract between the county and one of the cable internet providers says if there's 20 homes, they have to serve it. Okay. And the other provider back in the peninsula or in the county, there's actually 3, but the other one that serves this area, it's like they've already filled the requirement for the entire county of what they need to serve. And so they did get a quote if they wanted to, and that all literally it takes a line going across the street to give service to the street and then digging a trench down the road, which the family said they're willing to dig the trench. The company quoted him $100,000, which then if they got all the neighbors, all 16 households, they could divide it, 16 ways, but I don't think they're going to get all 16 neighbors to chip in. So say 10 of them chip in. That's still $10,000 per household.
Yeah, crazy. I want to get a read of the room. Who, since we started this conversation, feels better informed and more positive about how they access media?
Really?
Who feels less informed and less positive about how they interact with the media?
You can be honest, because I'm pretty cynical.
I'm actually hoping somebody raises their hand for that one. What are we not touching on? Does anyone have any questions or comments from the younger generation that the old guys aren't necessarily touching on? Any concerns that you have about how the news works or how media operates that we haven't hit? Yes.
I think National Geographic's owned by Murdoch, right? It's the channel. Okay. Rupert Murdoch. He owns the New York Post, Fox News, Fox TV, Fox Movies. Yeah.
The Republican Party.
Yeah. He owns the Republican Party. Okay, so I'm sorry. What's the question? You mean do the stuff that's on Nat Geo? Do I think that it's like taking a certain, putting a spin on things? I'm sure you could. I mean, I think those sort of, I used to work for Discovery Channel, by the way, but that was back when Discovery Channel, I thought, was actually doing positive programs, and then it all went to like reality programming. It's like Junk Shop America or whatever. But I think that like Nat Geo, the magazine, and television, and Discovery Channel back in the day probably raised awareness in a very positive way about the environment and nature, right? You were exposed to things all over the world that you never would have seen otherwise. And it's like, hey, maybe this is worth, saving. So And were they consciously putting a spin on it that way? Not maybe subtly, but the way that it works in the real world, you have these production companies who get commissioned by somebody like National Geographic or any large distributor, and so again, they're looking for this to reach the widest possible audience. So if it's too biased one way or the other, it's not going to gain traction with a wide audience. It's just like making a movie, right? You're spending $50–100 million to make a movie. You want to get the widest possible audience for it. So if it's going too far in one direction or the other, it's chances of it becoming a hit are less. Yeah. And Discovery definitely went to reality television because it was just cheaper than making a nature documentary and getting those shots of the eagle coming down and grabbing the fish. You got to wait like 6 months. I used to know all these photographers, videographers. They would literally go out 3–4 months to get a 5-second shot. Okay, it's expensive. They're going to want some money for doing that.
You just teed up perfectly my next question, which I think either you've been waiting for it or you're going to hate me for bringing this up. Our first speaker series last month, I had a tech analyst, Sean Dubervac, here, and we spent the whole time talking about the implications of AI in and outside of academia. Certainly we talked about inside academia, but when we talked about outside academia, it was similar types of concerns that we've talked about, for instance, with Twitter and Facebook, which is when technology comes, there's good and bad. There's a lot of things we have to wait to see how it settles and how we understand it, how we use it, and then we can better equip ourselves to tackle if there are challenges. I think it's safe to say generally that AI right now is so new and so modestly understood. We have no idea. But I'm curious, especially maybe starting with you and your colleagues, and then maybe on a more societal level, what are the kind of percolating effects of the expected impact of AI as a force of disruption?
No, it's going to be a huge force of disruption. And, there's a debate in all newsrooms right now about how much we should use it and how we should use it. We are using it, for example, to process, go out and do an interview and then putting it into Otter and having the transcript come back. Okay. It's a very, very convenient tool. You can take that transcript and you can put it into a chat GPT and say, give me the, out of this hour news conference, give me the 3 most important points that were raised. Okay. And it will do that for you. There's a discussion about whether, there's some radio stations now using AI voices, and it's starting out very modestly. It may be the weather report or the traffic report. If you listen really, really closely, if you've got a good ear, you can still kind of tell it's not a real person, but probably 90% of people probably could not tell most of the time. The difference is, and there's a company now offering, I think it's called Channel One, in any language. You just put in a script and it will have, you can choose male, female, blonde, brunette, bald, lots of hair, newscaster. It's a totally fake newscaster. Our AI generated, you cannot tell. I mean, a little bit, if you lip sync, it might be off, but it's off on regular TV anyway. Any language, right? We're going to be in a position probably 3 to 5 years is my guess, where even I, as somebody who really is paying attention and is looking out for this, will not be able to tell the difference between an AI voice, an AI newscaster, an AI generated image of a war, whatever. You'll be able to recreate whatever you want. I think for places like Pixar, with those kind of movies, it's going to be amazing what kind of stuff you're going to have, because you can, and again, it's great storytelling, right? Pixar, but the quality of the realism if that's what you want, will be perfect. You want to create a movie about World War II. Instead of hiring, people to build sets and getting these old airplanes from World War II and, this is what they have to do. They hire tanks, and you can kind of generate a background these days, but they usually go into take over some village in Latvia or something. And, that's why it costs $40–50 million. But when you're going to be able to do this in 3 months, just feed in a script, it'll create all the actors, create all the airplanes, all the background. It will be stellar. It'll be among the most amazing things you've ever seen. But it's all going to be totally fake, including the actors. And they'll be able to take, you want John Wayne, Elvis Presley, in the future, whoever, their estate will license the rights to their image. So, we'll have, for good or bad, Adam Sandler and Matt Damon, for 100 years. For now, they'll still be making movies. They'll be dead, but they'll be possibly big stars still.
Well, so what prompted me to think about AI, which you're talking about the picture of the eagle. I actually have a friend. Do you know Matt Mendelsohn, the photographer?
Name sounds familiar though.
Someone that's been in the industry for decades, and he's worked for news services, but he happened to be out in the country and caught a picture, I think, of a falcon or something getting a fish, and he put it on Facebook, and he was completely depressed because most of the people on his feed were like, "Oh, good one. That's good AI." And he's like, "I've been a photographer my whole life. I've been waiting for this moment."
Yeah.
And the cynicism of everyone thinking this is fake. But what I think the takeaway from that is, we were talking earlier about how kind of the zone is being flooded by whatever we want to call them, bad actors, bots, this notion of just getting a lot of stuff out there to confuse people. I think something like AI is an example of an unintended consequence, where just because there's going to be so much inauthentic, albeit impressive, art and photography, it's going to water down the overall trust. So when we go on the internet, we're going to be thinking, is that even a real picture, whether it's real or not? And that's certainly not something that we can address or remedy today, but it does give me pause to think that this is only going to get more complicated, not less complicated.
I have one glimmer of optimism. Okay, photography did not make art obsolete. Okay, the paintings done in the Renaissance or the sculptures of Leonardo da Vinci still awe us. Okay, all of this can be done, and has been able to been done by technology for decades. Television was supposed to kill off the radio. It did, because the storytelling, a lot of it's shifted, but radio, reinvented itself by playing music and, having talk shows and doing news and, all that sort of stuff in different formats. One station would play country, another one would play jazz, another would play rock. Back in the old days, it was all block programming, 1 hour of jazz, and then there would be, an hour of gospel music and, whatever. So the technologies will, I think, continue to find relevancy. If they don't, then maybe they deserve to die, right? And it's the same thing, like your friend with the photography will still hopefully, be in awe of that magical moment that he catches, that, that this is real. And, again, everything that comes along, like the first 3D movies were like 1950s. I think it became a fad in the late 50s. I think the first one was like Vincent Price, House of Wax or something like that. And it was a gimmick for a while. And then, people, we don't want to wear these silly glasses and all that. And so now, what the big companies are pushing on us is this, immersive technology, but you got to wear there was the Google Glass, and now what's the Apple one that's out now? that, you wear the glasses. What is it
Oh,
called?
it's actually called the Apple VR.
Apple VR? Apple Vision Pro. Okay. Have you tried it? Okay. It's like what I've heard is everybody got really excited about it. And, then there's one guy, the ultimate there was a guy driving his Tesla hands off wearing one of these, that was sort of the ultimate, technology statement. But people are like, I just don't want to wear these glasses. Now, when it's a chip implanted into your brain, hopefully voluntarily, if that's what you want, then, people might go for it. But just because it comes, it's a greater version of reality, supposedly, is it necessarily going to catch on? I don't know. It's a big question mark because it doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So there hasn't been a question from this side of the room yet. Who's gonna give us a question or a comment? It's got to be something. Who's going to be the hero that steps up and asks us a question? Is there a hero in our midst? No heroes? What about this side of the room? Yes.
And also essentially like generations already can't decide or decipher what's real and what's not. Like you guys talked about the first half, how are we to take what you said, try it like this? Hearing what you said the first half, okay, I know how to better find my news. But now with AI, how am I supposed to just like, it's taking away that human to human interaction.
Yeah.
So how are we supposed to pick what's news when it's coming from an AI?
Well, just because it's coming from AI generated doesn't mean that the content is fake. Because what they're doing with this Channel One project, you still have to write the script, right, for the newscast. You just don't need a real live anchor person to read the news. But the script that's presumably real news and what's coming out of the lips of this fake AI generated newscaster is the actual real news. Okay.
How's AI going to affect how we feel about journalism and going out and seeing things, all this stuff?
Well, you still remember, you still have to gather the raw content. Okay. You still have to go, if there's like, a house is on fire, I guess you could send a camera on a drone and beam back the video live. But I'm optimistic that the journalists are still the interpreters, okay, that are going to be involved in packaging that information because, do you just want to look at a live feed of a house fire for 2 hours? I mean, maybe there are people that are really into fire departments and, fire trucks and will be into that and they'll be able to do that. But you're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to see, the 10-second clip of the fire and the firemen coming out, rescuing the little girl and the dogs. And, there's going to be somebody who's going to gather the information and tell you who the girl was, what breed the dogs were, who's the hero fireman, all that. We're still going to have people processing the information. And I just want to say, if we're talking about all this futuristic stuff, the best portrait of this and the best warning to society that I've ever seen from all the, the sci-fi movies I've ever watched and everything was Wall-E. Did you ever see Wall-E? Okay, watch that. Yeah, I thought it's spot on.
Yeah.
And, we're heading to that laziness. Yes. I think whoever was it used brought up laziness. Okay. Kylie, that's a good one. Yeah. It's least common denominator. It's sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? The osmosis, the state of going back to inertia. Right. So, I mean, we have to, some of us are more disciplined than others. Like nobody's forcing you to go to the gym. If you're an adult, nobody's forcing you to eat carrots. But you're making that choice because you know that it's good for you to do that. But if you just want to sit on the sofa all day and, eat Hostess Twinkies and, watch soap operas. I mean, it's a free country. You can do that. You're not going to be very well informed. You're probably, going to die, earlier than, people who go to the gym and work out and eat healthy, but it's your choice, right? Why not? It's a free country.
I would add to what Steve said to your question. He had mentioned earlier, very early on, multiple sources. That's always a good habit for anything, for a research paper, for how you're getting your news, how you're processing what's going on in the world. Having a couple of sources that you've identified as consistently reliable is a good strategy. And I think in terms of AI and technology, lest we sound like we're super pessimistic, I write poetry, so I'm very connected to an analog world and very optimistic that we've been reading poetry for thousands of years. So there's certain technologies that come and go, but they're not going to. They've never been able to successfully replace human interaction. I just read an article. I didn't read the article, but I saw the headline, and I think it was in the New York Times, but it was something about online dating services, which I guess have become extremely popular in the last decade. But the point of this particular article was there's a group of younger dating folks that are actively resisting because they want more spontaneity. They want more in person. So I think the good thing about when there's so much technology and it's free and there's all this computer generated stuff, I think human nature, we eventually need and want that human contact, that human interaction. So I think there's a push and pull throughout history of how technology scares us, maybe messes things up. But at the end of the day, certain ways that we've always verified truth, that we've had meaningful relationships, I think those are likely to remain unchanged because as humans, we kind of demand that.
Yeah, we get back to an equilibrium after a period of tumult. But you don't use for your poetry the online haiku generator? You don't use that? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the only value add of poetry, right, is, and this goes back to like English 101, right? Like the words are all, like you could put the collected works of Shakespeare into an AI machine and it would spit out new poems. But the idea of why those poems or why any movie or book endures is because it was the way those particular words were chosen and expressed. If you took some of the best poems or stories that have ever been written, some of them, the language is amazing. But if you just looked at it word by word, I think anyone might be tempted to say, well, what's the big deal? Anyone could do that. And the reality, which is beautiful, is anyone could do that. But artists try to find ways or are good at finding ways to express heroes and villains and love and loss in different ways to make us remember that we're all human. So I think it does always come back to this element of primarily we want to know and feel like we're human. And I think there's hope in that.
Well, I'll tell you what the real test will be with the AI revolution. William Gibson was one of my favorite sci-fi authors in his world, books like Neuromancer and things like that. When we have the first, #1 hit where music pop song, where the lyrics and the music were AI generated and the performer is AI generated and it hits #1, that's going to change everything because all of the people in the industry will say, why should we take our chances with, real people? Remember, they want high salaries, they want no green M&Ms in their, waiting room. That will be revolutionary. And then when, the first, box office smash, a movie gets made for $3 million and brings in $200 million in 3 weeks, nobody's, a lot of people won't want to, the big people won't want to make movies anymore. But, anybody seen, it just came out, movie called Civil War? Okay, as I posted on Facebook, I said, I need a few days to process this. So I won't talk about the content of the movie, But in that movie, one of the protagonists, one of the main characters, she's a young photojournalist. This is supposed to take place in the near future. And she's carrying her father's Nikon film cameras. Okay. And this is a, big thing now, right? It's like the slow food movement, right? You can't zip off 100 photos in 3 seconds. You have to be really careful. You have to know the basics of photography. You have to develop the film, and there's an art process literally to doing that. And, again, I have shot film still from time to time, and it's like, if I get a really good film photograph, it's like, wow, I really feel like I've accomplished something. So I just, again, as I went back to, radio was going to kill newspapers, TV was going to kill radio, internet was going to kill TV, which it probably will. But there's still going to be a niche for these. Why do we still go to religious services in person? You don't have to. You can get all this stuff online. You can sit at home. There's something about being in that environment. The human is the human to human contact. And you're going somewhere. You go into an old church. There's the light streaming through the windows. There's, depending on which religion, the smell of the incense coming in, the wood floors, the echo in the building. You can't recreate all of that sensory imagery with just technology.
Yeah. Okay, you guys have really hung in there. I appreciate it. I do want to make sure if there were questions that everyone was heard. The hero section, anything? Any last questions, comments, concerns? Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, it already is. The catch is for you, are you just looking for somebody to confirm your biases, who's telling you what you already believe or revalidating what you want to happen? Or are you looking for someone who's going to give you new information and challenge your thinking? That's really, really key. I think we should all want our thinking challenged. We should look at news sources that we don't agree with and critique them. Okay. I think though the challenge is like the people that are the most provocative, the most sensational are the ones likely to pop up on your radar screen because of the algorithm. But if you find somebody, there's nothing wrong with finding them provocative, but if you're looking for information and you think they're giving you a good, like I said, a good healthy diet of a variety of news, there's no rocket science to this, right? Anybody these days, especially with the technology, can create a virtual news network. The trick is whether, it's going to be reliable and informative and compelling, and that's for you to decide, right? It's your choice. And there will be people out there that, and there already are, on YouTube and TikTok, people that have, 1 million people following them and can make money off of it. But is it just about, do you want it just for entertainment, for dogs doing tricks and, people lip syncing? Or do you want somebody out there who's helping better inform you as a citizen of the country? And I don't care whether they're left wing or right wing or, whatever. What I do care about is whether they're being honest, an honest broker of the information. And that's where I see things falling down, both on the left and on the right. On the left, it tends to be if you don't speak in a certain way and use a certain type of language and encapsulate it in a certain form, you know, I don't like it. And on the right, of course, it's like, if you're not, you know, taking these positions on these particular issues and you're not supporting, you know, a certain candidate, but the truth is the left politically is very split in this country. There's a huge difference between progressives and, you know, left of centrist Democrats. And, you know, on the right, I mean, this is happening in real time now. The you know, abortion issue and what's happening, pay attention to what's happening in Arizona with the territorial 1864 law on abortion, which is dividing people in the Republican Party, and how certain presidential candidates, you know, are forming or stating their opinions on these issues. There's a lot of stuff right now in flux, and I think it's very important, whether, you know, you're on the left, center, or centrist, or, you know, totally agnostic, don't care about any of this stuff, for at least you to get objective information and you decide. And you're probably not going to get that from one person on YouTube. You know, you're going to have to go out and seek a variety of sources. But it's like, if you have a friend and you find out, you know, that friend's very entertaining and you like hanging out with that friend, but if you find that that friend is lying to you all the time, you know, do you still want to be friends with that person? So that's how you have to look at the content online.
Yeah. My parting shot is that I think with all this chaos, there's also this opportunity. And I think we should acknowledge that despite an abundance of sources and content and this pressure and confusion, we do live in a country still where the opportunity to compete and put stories out there is a possibility. So there's always opportunity in that chaos. And I would just say, from my modest purview, there are powerful forces in this country that want nothing more than the younger generation to disengage and check out and say they're all the same. I don't pay attention to this. You owe it to yourself to be as well informed as you can be, whatever way you vote, whatever you choose to do with your life. Don't let forces beat you into submission and make you think that your voice doesn't matter, because your voice matters a great deal. And when you tell your story in your own way, it's going to make the world a better place. That is for sure.
I couldn't have said it better, Sean.
Well,
So I won't.
Please join me. It was a great opportunity, a tremendous honor to share the stage. Steve, thank you for being here. Hopefully you'll come back and talk to us again, maybe post-election, and we can assess what we saw, what we learned. But please join me in thanking him, and thank you all for coming out today.